The Columbia Broadcasting System presents Norman Corwin's One World Flight.
Standing in the Maikovsky station of the metro under the heart of Moscow, a waiting train signals to workmen in the subway to clear the track. You're strolling along Hallam Street in London, and you're overtaken by a Cockney street peddler selling cut iris, cut cauliflower, Yorkshire blue peas, and brand new potatoes. You're in the library of a pleasant house in New Delhi, India, talking with Pandit Nehru about the world and the future. He says,
but if we think of freedom for one world, then all this racialism and one race or one nation or one country being fundamentally superior to another, that has to be given up. No doubt people are not all alike. Nations are not alike. Everybody is not the same or as clever or as strong as anybody else.
You're in a hotel in Manila, sleeping at 6:45 in the morning, and suddenly you're awakened by sounds of the reconstruction of the Philippines going on right outside your window. What you've just listened to, the hammering, Mr. Nehru, the peddler, and the subway train, are fragments among several hundred authentic sounds of foreign places and voices of foreign people to be heard in a new series of CBS broadcasts beginning with this one.
Last February, two American organizations, the Willkie Memorial and the Common Council for American Unity, established an award consisting of a flight around the globe, a flight intended to dramatize and perpetuate Wendell Willkie's concept of one world. The first winner of the award, chosen on the basis of contributions already made to this ideal, was the CBS playwright and producer, Norman Corwin. Last June, Mr. Corwin, with Lee Bland of CBS and a magnetic wire recorder, set out on a globe-circling trip, in the course of which they preserved 100 hours of the voices and opinions of the people of 16 countries. Tonight and every Tuesday night for the next 12 weeks, Mr. Corwin will bring you the story and record of his One World Flight. Footnote. All native music, all identified sounds, all foreign voices heard in these broadcasts were actually recorded by Corwin and Bland in various parts of the world. These singers, for example, are Arab women sitting on a rooftop in Cairo on a warm evening last August, celebrating the independence of Egypt, an historic event which occurred that very morning.
This is Norman Corwin. These broadcasts have to do with some of the people of the world and with much of the state of the peace. And therefore I believe they have to do with you and me. For today, if war comes anywhere, it will be close to us. No place is far anymore. We are one with others, whether we want to be or not. Tonight, we will stop in no single country, but by way of preview, introduce you to some of the hope and despair that exists side by side in the world today. This aspect I present first before beginning to tell you any progressive story of the flight, because to the observer traveling as I did, it is what strikes you first and asserts itself most often. The war has left in its wake all kinds of attitudes and conditions of mind and spirit, ranging from unshakable confidence to active fear. And it becomes apparent at least it did to me, that in the drawing together toward the middle of extremes of economic, social, political, and even of certain religious philosophies lies the safest, if not the only way, to a lasting peace. Within this theme, you will hear tonight moments out of interviews with people high and low, optimists, pessimists, liberals, fascists, communists, stevedores, prime ministers. For example, in the cabinet room at number 10 Downing Street, you sit with the British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, at the long, bare cabinet table. He puffs a pipe, and he answers your questions in a friendly, relaxed manner.
After all, we're trying to clear up after the greatest war in history, and you can't expect all the problems of that war, and a good many left over from the First World War, to disappear overnight. Trouble is, of course, all the differences make the dramatic news. But I think it's worthwhile paying some attention to the areas of activity in which there's agreement.
Hopeful enough. But then there's the poor widow Camilla in the Italian mountain village of Lanuvio, who lost all her hopes in a single day of war. You stand in a square of a shattered village, under the broiling sun. Her neighbors crowd about you. You ask her questions through an interpreter.
How big is her family?
Quanti figli ha? Avevo 3 figli, 2 mi sono morti così con l'incursione aerea, insomma, queste cannonate. È rimasto uno che poi io devo avere così per morto.
She had 3 children. 2 have died, and she has 1 alive now. 2 of them were killed in the bombardment.
Now, what about her husband?
E il vostro marito?
È morto lì, tutti insieme sono morti con l'incursione.
Her husband was killed in the same bombardment. All of them died together. 2 children and a husband.
I see. So she has 1 child left.
There's 1 child left.
Mio marito, 2 figli, 2 nipoti, 3 cognati, una cognata, insomma 10 persone sono morte di famiglia.
She lost her father and her husband, as well as 2 children and about 10 relatives, close relatives in all.
You ask where she lives, what she gets to eat. She says she never eats breakfast. At midday, she has a thin soup, and in the evening, a piece of bread.
Can she not afford to eat more, or is there not enough food available?
Non c'ho denaro per poter comprarlo. Vedi che c'ho sto figlio, ce l'ho, che adesso ce l'ha una zia, ma ce l'ha un'altra, e perché io non posso tenerlo?
It's because she has no money, and the situation is so bad that she sort of farms her little boy out to various relatives who can feed him a little better every now and then.
And what are her hopes for an improvement in this condition?
Avete speranza che si cambiano gli affari? O che speranza avete?
Io so di neppure io che speranza posso avere.
It's very difficult to say. She has no idea at all what she can hope to look for.
And then the tall, thin finance minister of Denmark, Thorkel Christensen, who's not so sure that we're finished making widows through warfare. You interview him in an anteroom to the House Chamber in the Parliament building in Copenhagen. He pauses for a long moment before he answers your point-blank question about war.
Do you feel that there's going to be another war? I'm very much afraid of it. In fact, you are. You think there's a real danger of it? I think that.
And across the world from Copenhagen, at a dockside in the beautiful harbor of Sydney on a clear, sharp day of the Australian spring, a big, gray-haired, God-fearing stevedore takes time off from loading the good ship Corinda to point out a path for the nations.
I'm a member of the aristocracy of the working class. That's the Waterside Workers' Federation. Now, we're looked upon as the aristocracy because we give leads in matters of progress that affect the workers.
Now, where did you learn your very good extemporaneous power of speech?
I learnt it from intense study for many years, by myself.
You were not a university man, a college man?
No. I've only had an ordinary education, but by the power of God through the Holy Spirit, He has put in my heart words that are acceptable to hearers by trying to live the life. Trying, mark you. I don't say that I've succeeded, but I've made a reasonably successful effort.
Do you share with the two gentlemen that I've just interviewed here confidence that we are going to get through the next 25 or 50 years without war?
No, you will not get through without war unless the world regenerates itself in a sincere line. I would suggest that the great powers assure Russia that they do not want war, and also get an assurance from her that she is satisfied to work out her own destiny with the territory she has and her compensation as the result of a terrific sacrifice of this war.
And in Russia, the editor of the Moscow News, Mr. Borodin, addresses a dinner given you at the Hotel Metropole by the Soviet Society for Foreign Cultural Relations. He speaks very slowly, professing the friendship of his country for America, describing what he calls Russia's, quote, tremendously difficult struggle to protect the great interests of a great people, unquote. And then he warns against those who are crying for war. You may have difficulty at first making out the words conflagration and influence and the name of the writer Gorky.
Please tell your people that conflagrations don't start at once. They start from a spark. From those who apparently have no influence. But the conflagration starts, and there are people who would start a world conflagration, as our great Gorky said, in order that it be warm for some people. Let me repeat it. Gorky said that there are people in the world who would start a conflagration so long as it affords them a bit of warmth. They don't care for the interest of humanity so long as it keeps them warm. Those are the warmongers, the war profiteers. Those are the reactionaries who created fascism, who brought up fascism, and who are still cherishing the hope of someday using fascism in order to kill you and me and every man, woman, and child who profess the great ideals of democracy.
The phrase, one world, comes easy. Nothing hard to remember about it. There was a time when the world meant to the average man a blur of lands and matters outside his life. Long journeys he could never take, languages he would never understand, and customs he could never fathom. But twice in our time, the world reached into his life and shook him up. That was the least it did. It was a world problem, not a local feud, which took your neighbor's boy out of his class, put him in uniform, and killed him. And it could happen again. Tonight, if you think much about it, one world means, urgently and above everything else, survival. It has higher meanings, of course, such as the wholesale rewards of total unity, meanings not comfortably smirked at or dismissed, like goodwill and the brotherhood of man. But it was within the less idealistic meaning of the phrase, within the immediate and concrete meaning, that I set out on this trip. I went looking for practical testaments of agreement, or signs of a uniting world. I found less of these than we would wish for, but I also found plenty of hope. I listened to people's troubles and to nations' troubles, which are often the same thing. I witnessed many a disagreement, sometimes in the form of violence and death. But because I felt all of it belonged in the record, I took down as well as I could, whenever and wherever I could, what I thought related to the present and the future and to one world. At no time did I attempt to conduct a poll or to make mathematical measurements. In essence, I recorded that which I felt to be significant to us and to these days. Not always were the profoundest things said by presidents and premiers. Often, in quite unexpected places, ordinary people, humble people, spoke wisdom which came through interpretation undamaged. One night, I was dining outdoors at the Ghina restaurant in Rome, and I fell to talking with Sonego, a young Italian partisan who'd fought the Nazis in the mountains and killed a dozen of them with his bare hands. He was at first shy about talking because he looked upon me as a foreign correspondent. But at last, he opened up. You'll hear him for a moment and then the interpretation as it was pieced together.
Io non avrei risposto con molto piacere alle domande di un giornalista straniero.
I would have been rather unwilling to answer the question of a foreign correspondent because I know that Italy has been beaten in this war and that the winning party is the country to whom this foreign correspondent belongs. But once I've heard what the creed of Mr. Corwin is, that is to say, one world, I must say that is the creed of all my fellow partisans and of myself. That's what we used to say when we were lost in the mountains in heavy snow and rain, with nobody to protect us but the stars. Every one of us said, why isn't there one world, one flag under which we can all march and be united? That is why we have been fighting, and that is why we believe, and we sincerely believe, that all the world should be very simply unified under one flag, because we do not want to keep on fighting for separate flags, for several separate colors, but for one flag and one color throughout the world.
And the grease-stained Polish worker in the power plant on the banks of the Vistula in shattered Warsaw. I asked him what he, as a man who worked in the generation of power, thought of the possibilities of atomic energy replacing steam and coal. He answered,
No, możliwe to jest, ale w każdym razie jeszcze może energia atomowa jednak nie uwładni światem. I think that maybe it's possible, but I don't think that the atomic energy will be the biggest power in the world.
What does he think will be the biggest power in the world?
A to pan myśli, że będzie największą siłą na świecie? No to przypuszczam, że człowiek. I think that the human being.
He thought that the human being was a greater generator than steam or uranium. In the powerhouse, the restaurant, on the farm, by the dockyards, in chambers of parliament, in the ruined village, underground in mines, and in planes flying above clouds, I found few people anywhere who did not want exactly what you want: to live in peace, to let others live in peace, to prosper, to progress, to think freely, to speak, assemble, worship, and travel freely. Very, very few whom I met considered it sentimental and visionary to talk in terms of a unified world in which security and peace can become sensations greater than tension, crisis, and war. Some had doubts as to the way of achieving one world, or cynicism with respect to their chances of living to see it. But they all want it. They yearn for it. They are willing to work for it. There are exceptions, of course. I suppose there have to be in order to prove rules. The exceptions were mainly selfish or mal-educated people, or the type incapable of drawing any inference from all that has happened to them in their lives, incapable of learning the simplest lesson out of the costliest and most terrible experience in human history. There was, for example, the dockhand in the same group as the self-styled aristocrat of the workers. This fellow thought Hitler was not a bad sort at all. He felt the Fuhrer had rescued Germany from a great evil.
Well, I was in Hamburg in 1923, and the conditions brought about by the Jews in Germany, they staked into Germany when the war was on, when the last war was on, and the conditions brought about by the Jewish occupation in Germany were frightful.
And a young Australian accountant on the busy street corner who said he was convinced that fascism was dead and buried. The body, he said, lies molding in the grave and will for a long time. Yet he had a race theory that was mighty like a fascist's.
But I consider that the potential danger to world peace lies in the coloured races. I can see in embryo, more or less, I can see in the very backward primitive peoples of the islands and the Inter-Asia, the parts of Asia that I visited, a potential Japanese. I consider that he, given the same opportunity as the Japanese, as many people would today, they talk about raising his standard of living, educating him, and more or less raising him to our standard, which is an highly industrial and mechanical standard. I think that he will possibly become a Frankenstein monster and turn on us and devour us as the Japanese.
And the young girl in devastated Manila, who, though she well knew what war can be, still could make this recommendation to America.
If I were you people in America, I am going to induce President Truman right now to finish up Russia, because if he does that right now, we have no worry about her in the future.
There were long distances and intervals between people who recommended this kind of solution for the world's problems. The last such instance before this one came 10,000 miles earlier, not directly, but within a story told me by an UNRWA worker, an American woman in Italy. She told this story of the way she had celebrated VJ Day in Bologna.
I was in Bologna on VJ Day when I'd heard the first word that the war with Japan was over. I went into the nearest American hotel because I was very anxious to be around some fellow countrymen at this time. And I introduced myself to two young American lieutenants who were with the Air Corps. One of the boys talked with me and said that his father was a very wealthy man, and his father had always been in favor of wars because he thought it was a good way of reducing the population. But he said he felt sure that his father, after his being in the war, and after his father knew about the horrors of the atom bomb, would change even his mind. Consequently, this boy thought there was a good hope for future permanent peace. And suddenly a man came up, another officer. He walked up, joined us, commenced talking about the atom bomb, and said that in his mind America had already lost the war and had done a very serious thing when it had not used the atom bomb on Russia. One of the young lieutenants arose, walked quietly over to where the other officer was standing who had made this remark, hit him with all his strength, and said, "You have desecrated this day for me."
Among people who had experienced war, the sentiments of this officer whose jaw was hit and of the Filipino girl whose city had been hit were rare. Much more representative were the Czech underground fighter Dr. Seeby and the businessman Egil in Bathurst and the son of the founding president of China, Dr. Sun Fo, in Nanking. The first of these, Dr. Seeby, was an underground fighter, a lawyer who had been captured by the Nazis, tortured with exceptional cruelty, and sentenced to die. I bring you now the voice of Dr. Seeby in his full statement, except that the recording is poor, as you can hear from this sentence.
This is what would be my message, my humble message to the United Nations.
Dr. Seeby said, quote, "This is what would be my humble message to the United Nations. Not to breed the idea that there is a necessity of a war between the Western and Eastern conceptions of life. I know that this is the last hope of fascism. In every part of the world, and especially in Germany, fascists and reactionaries do everything in their power to breed the conception of the inevitability of war. I hate this conception, and I am deeply convinced that it is not true," unquote. My talk with Dr. Seeby was in the lobby of a hotel in Prague. 17,000 miles further along in the trip, in the city of Bathurst, on the edge of the Blue Mountains in New South Wales, the owner of a prosperous canning factory, Mr. Egil, was in essential agreement with Dr. Seeby. I had a long interview with this industrialist in his noisy plant one morning, and at the end of it he said,
The bogey of communism, and I think a great deal less than it was some years ago. And anyway, we're beginning to realize that communists are ordinary people, much like ourselves, and their views cannot in the long run be so very greatly different to our own. And why shouldn't one be optimistic? What's the good of being pessimistic? I think it's only by optimism that we can create a better world. We can get better living conditions, perhaps shorter hours of work, and perhaps more money to spend and more leisure for sport. Maybe that's the best thing, the thing we all want, but whatever it is, we've got to work together and be optimistic of the final result.
Another man who thought it important to get together and in a country which badly needs it, was Dr. Sun Fo, son of the late great Dr. Sun Yat-sen, founder of the Chinese Republic. Dr. Sun, now president of China's Legislative Yuan, spoke at a diplomatic reception to us in Nanking. Dr. Sun said he'd been asked by Chinese newspapermen outside to comment on whether he thought that the opposing Kuomintang and communist parties were sincere about wanting peace. He told the meeting,
I believe, naturally, that the Chinese government and the Kuomintang are really sincere about peace within China. I also believe that the Chinese Communist Party is also sincere about peace. For there is no man in his senses who would want war and bloodshed.
A lawyer who had fought in the underground, a government leader, and a businessman, 17,000 miles apart, but eye to eye on the necessity of getting together. And all along those 17,000 miles, and the 20,000 more which lay across our route, the majority of people everywhere had, to greater or lesser degree, hope, optimism, confidence. This, in spite of the fact that many had lost their loved ones and had seen their countrymen die, had been invaded and pillaged, had suffered cold, starvation, torture. They were hopeful, in spite of the known terrors of the last war. Hopeful they would not be made to know the thousandfold terrors of any next war. There were places in the world where hope was feeble or had been extinguished. And there the concept of one world had the toughest going. Among the helpless, the homeless, the underfed, the underpaid, the undereducated, the underprivileged. And it seemed to me that not the least job to be done is to distribute hope, or the reason to hope, among those elements of great populations who today are hopeless and helpless. If the confidence of the lawyer in Prague and the businessman in Bathurst could be shared with the fellaheen of Egypt and the untouchable of India and with the widow of Lanuvio, then perhaps we'd be getting on toward the world of Wendell Willkie's dream. But in the meantime, as I went around, the widow became to me a symbol of hopelessness. This woman with no food, no home, no prospects, her husband and 2 children buried in the ruins of fascism. I heard her voice in many places far from Italy.
Non c'ho più l'uomo, non c'ho più figli, non c'ho più nessuno, c'ho sto ragazzino soltanto da dire avanti. Io ho detto che ce l'ho così. Che mi porta
This voice and the echo of guns only lately stilled, and the silence of the cemeteries, the begging of alms and the whimper of hungry children. This voice and the mute rubble of wasted towns and cities, these were the sounds of need. Need for the hope and for the reality of a united world. I invite you to be with us next week when we will board a Constellation and begin the story of the flight as it started in New York.
You have been listening to Norman Corwin, CBS playwright, producer, and first winner of the One World Award in the first of a series of Columbia broadcasts entitled One World Flight, the authentic story with recordings of his 37,000-mile global trip. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
The Columbia Broadcasting System presents Norman Corwin's One World Flight. Little Jane, the English-speaking schoolgirl in the Russian broadcast.
Good morning, good morning, good morning to you. Good morning, good morning. We are glad to see you.
And the beggar song in the Chinese program. And the Maori chorus in the report from New Zealand. You have just listened to voices recorded in Russia, China, and New Zealand. 3 excerpts among the hundreds heard in the course of 12 broadcasts in this unique and unprecedented CBS series, which comes to a close tonight. For this is the 13th and last program based upon Norman Corwin's recent global tour as first winner of the One World Flight Award. At the end of the broadcast, Mr. Corwin will announce on behalf of the One World Award Committee the second recipient of the award. The name of the man who will start out on another globe-circling trip this year in the interests of peace and one world.
This is Norman Corwin. Just as a traveler re-entering this country declares his purchases at customs, I submit for inspection in this last broadcast the main impressions of my global trip. The first of them is that in less than 2 years since victory, too much has been forgotten. This was reinforced in my mind by an experience of the past week. I was hunting through recordings of the One World flight and came across a mislaid item which didn't belong in the log. It was a disc made by the BBC in London in September 1940. I played it, and what came from my loudspeaker jolted me back to those days and made me realize anew how much has been forgotten. Here's the authentic soundtrack of a mere 20 seconds out of Britain's war. Only a fragment of one of 1,000 nights of terror which visited cities and towns far from the fronts. But it brought back the time when each fresh headline told worse news than the one before. When Nazi conquest spread from the Arctic down through the English Channel, over the Balkans, into North Africa, eastward to the Volga and the oil fields of the Caucasus. These were only a few bombs in a district of London, but they recreated Dunkirk and Pearl Harbor, the collapse of Singapore, the fall of Tobruk. It was not so long ago that our papers were printing casualty lists. The telegrams went out each morning. Those were the days when there was a working unity among the United Nations. People were speculating about the chances of ending this war, not the prospects of beginning another. Wendell Willkie flew around the globe and wrote a book called One World, which roused the hopes of the American people, which gave them a vision of a future secure from bombs and violence, from the anguish and horror that is war. Those were the days when we regarded Russia not as a menace, but as a courageous ally and friend, when we waited tensely for the last bulletin from each disputed street corner in Stalingrad. I was deeply disturbed by this souvenir of the Blitz on London. I looked up another memento of fascist warfare, nothing at all dramatic, merely a recording I made for my own notes on a sleepy summer afternoon last July in Czechoslovakia. I know you'll forgive a recording of my own voice in view of the fact that the men of this place could not speak for themselves.
This is Liedete. Today there is nothing here but grass and weeds. It is all overgrown except for a clearing in what was once the center of the village, where is the monument to the dead of Liedete. There is an enclosed area of about 50 square feet. At a small gate to this enclosed area is an inscription, "Do not walk on that which we love most dearly." Signed, "The Woman of Liedete."
No one was walking on the sacred grounds of Liedete, or Anzio, or Lublin, or Iwo Jima, all of whose graves contained that which someone loved most dearly. But there were people we met here and there around the world who have forgotten. And there were even more people who believed that America has forgotten. In all too many of the countries overrun by war, people felt that America, as the only major power fortunate enough to have escaped blasted cities and severe privation, did not deeply enough understand the war. This feeling, expressed more in sorrow than criticism, was voiced by such people as the educator who lived only a few miles from Liedete, Professor Kozak of Charles University in Prague, who'd lost his own son, a flyer. He asked Americans to bear in mind the differences between countries which had experienced varying degrees of war.
I think you must bear in mind that the mentality and the mood in the countries overrun and tortured by the German occupation forces, by the Gestapo and so on, is different from the almost unbroken happiness and sweet reasonableness of countries untouched by war.
The professor was being ironical when he spoke of unbroken happiness and sweet reasonableness, for he knew well that little of either quality is to be found around the world. There are, instead, varying degrees of trouble, anxiety, and tension, created in the main by the unreasonableness of particular parties, factions, and individuals, never by large masses of people, created by men who have already forgotten. Unwittingly, unintentionally, some of them walk on the graves of those we love most dearly when they talk of the certainty of another war, when they talk of the inevitability of a showdown clash between two or more worlds. This talk is dangerous, and that it is dangerous was emphasized all the way around the world, from England through Russia to the Antipodes. There was the American in Rome, Dr. Eva Landsberg, an UNRWA physician who last July had this forbidding thing to say about the war spirit in Germany.
I don't know how it is in other countries, but in Germany today we have one only voice, and that is not will there be another war, but when will there be another war. Everything is pushing towards the suppression of everything that is against the next war, and coming to a point where all forces, DPs, Germans, and many Americans are looking forward to a war against the Soviet Union.
And in the Soviet Union itself, the editor Boranin of the Moscow News warned against what he called warmongers who would create a world conflagration merely because it would afford themselves a bit of warmth.
Please tell your people that conflagrations don't start at once. They start from a spark. But big conflagrations start, and there are people who will start a world conflagration, as our great Willkie said, in order that it be warm for some people. They don't care for the interest of humanity, so long as it keeps them warm. Those are the warmongers, the war profiteers. Those are the reactionaries.
And 20,000 miles further along in the trip, in another latitude and another accent, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Peter Fraser, quietly scolded those who talk of inevitable war.
I think that those who talk about the inevitability of war are doing a great deal of harm.
On the basis of hundreds of interviews, out of the essence of 1,000 kaleidoscopic impressions, All of us seem to be farther from Willkie's One World today than when his thesis was published 5 years ago. Everybody seemed to be agreed on the desirability of one world, but very few on the method. Recommendations came easily, but they were as varied as languages and customs. In England, Clement Attlee recommended patience. In France, Louis Aragon asked for remembrance of the past. Women should organize, said Mrs. Hamar in Stockholm. Begin with the children, said Mrs. Hettelgren. More frankness among diplomats, said Alsing Anderson of the Danish Parliament in these words.
I think that the first condition is that the nations and their spokesmen, both the politicians and the journalists in the press, speak frankly to one another.
Combine moral and material resources, said Hans Engen in Norway. Develop the social sciences, said Peter Kapitsa in Russia. Destroy suspicion the moment it arises in international affairs, said the President of Poland. Exchange artists, said the actor Jan Verek in Prague. Education, said Dr. Wan in Nanking. Return to the principles of Franklin Roosevelt, said Mr. Orell in Manila. Implement the 4 freedoms, said Pandit Nehru in India, adding,
You cannot cooperate with people who are not free and who are suffering from all manner of complexes of fear and the rest. Therefore, those countries who have power and influence in the world today should themselves give the lead in this matter and work out as rapidly as possible the ideal of, call it the 4 freedoms or what you like, that no nation, no people should be subjected to another. No race should be considered an inferior race as a race.
There were a few recommendations, some of which you've heard on this series in past weeks, for the achievement of one world by violent means. Drop an atom bomb on Russia without delay, said some people, such as this Filipino woman in Manila.
If I were you people in America, I am going to induce President Truman right now to finish up Russia. Because if he does that right now, we have no worry about her in the future.
She was not the only one to propose war as an instrument of peace, but she belonged to an infinitesimally small minority among the people we met. Most of the men and women we questioned about the atom bomb expressed either fear of it as a weapon of unimaginable horror or hope that atomic energy could be put to work as soon as possible for constructive and peaceful ends. Now and then we ran into the view that atomic war would be only little worse than any other kind, since any other kind was bound to be catastrophic anyway. Professor Edie Verlander, head of the Swedish Engineering Research Academy, was of this mind.
Any kind of war would be catastrophic for Sweden. I don't think the atomic war would be worse than any other.
And across the Baltic from Stockholm, Professor Ignaz Latowski, Poland's delegate to the Atomic Energy Commission of the United Nations, took a similar view.
We see here in Warsaw that it was possible to destroy a city without using the atom bomb. And it is certainly true that if there are conditions now or in the future for another war, no one will think in terms of using atom bomb if it is necessary to start a war. And yet, the atomic energy can improve our standard of living tremendously. We see today that in Poland, where is so much to rebuild, if we could use a new source of energy to get it.
But most of the people we quizzed, we weren't attempting to conduct a poll or anything like that, said they were sorry the atom bomb was kicking around in the world, sorry that any country which found the secret might build the bomb, sorry the world hadn't agreed on a way to control it yet, sorry it might lead to an atomic armaments race. A sheep herder in the back blocks of Australia was among these people.
Well, not much about that. I think it's a pity they have it. What do you recommend we do about it? Everybody have it.
We heard 1,000 opinions on a great many subjects, but there was only one point on which everybody agreed, one in which I, as a traveling American, took pride. It was the view that the United States is unquestionably a colossus in the world without precedent and without peer. When I started out, I had hoped to find that our enormous resources and prestige and the greatness of our democratic tradition were helping to lead peoples out of suspicion, tension, and fear. But I was dismayed too often. to find that the reservoir of goodwill toward the United States, about which Wendell Willkie spoke enthusiastically in 1942, had drained to a low level. From all I had read, I expected to find, and did find, areas of suspicion, fear, and criticism of Russia in certain countries, but I did not expect to find the United States also suspected, disliked, and resented, to find that we are known in some quarters by our worst features and not our best. This Austrian refugee, Mr. Straw, for example.
The lynching of Negroes gives me an uncomfortable feeling because I think of Nazi Germany and the persecution of the Jews and other peoples.
And in Rome, Sergio Amadei, writer of the prize film The Open City, expressed concern, through an interpreter, over what he believed to be this country's preoccupation with military matters.
There is a danger that Americans will forget their responsibilities in, if you will pardon the word, a drunkenness of victory. I am afraid that in America, I don't mean fascism, they are developing a preoccupation with defense, which is dominating the idea of peace.
And the woman in the town hall of Sydney, Australia, speaking from the floor during a question period following an address on One World.
I feel that there is a great danger in America of a native fascist movement with this lynching of Negroes and such things going on there, and I feel the American people, the trade unionists, must be very vigilant and must fight this fascism, which may be a danger to the whole world and not only to lovers of democracy within America itself.
And the inference by Ambassador Paul V. McNutt that the United States cannot expect the reservoir of goodwill in the Philippines to take care of itself automatically.
The reservoir of goodwill is intact, but there are certain obligations on us to keep that reservoir intact.
Less than halfway around the world, I got the feeling, which strengthened as I progressed, that all nations should do more about the principle of cultural exchange, especially as it applies between countries whose political relations are strained. It's pleasant enough to exchange artists and students and new compositions with countries who love us, but cultural exchange takes on its greatest meaning and value in cases where the respective peoples, knowing too little of each other, harbor mutual suspicions and apprehensions. What you're now hearing in the background is the Russian composer Aram Khachaturian playing a theme from a new unpublished work in the living room of his home in Moscow. Our visit there was typical of this kind of exchange. Before the interview was over, we understood better something of the Russian attitude toward culture, among other things, and he perhaps understood something of the American view. When he finished playing, we got down to a rambling 2-hour conversation which ended in our toasting the peace, friendship, and prosperity of both our countries. Multiply this meeting, itself insignificant, by several hundred or thousand, and the principle of exchange could begin to assume proportions as a device for helping break down the barriers and misconceptions which keep people apart. But it seemed to me, as I went around, that the greatest peril today is a sort of phobia created by factions who would have people everywhere believe there is no room in one world for more than one economic and social system. In view of the existing facts, such a world obviously could not be achieved without a war in which one crushes the other. The idea of there being room for only one system would be easier to accept if it were not for the fact that in several of the countries we visited, notably Britain, Sweden, New Zealand, and Czechoslovakia, it was impossible to distinguish whether we were in a world of capitalism or socialism, since patterns were being sought which would blend the best features of both. And there was a remarkable unity within these countries, in spite of the fact that several parties were represented in each government. In Czechoslovakia, whose economy as well as geography represents a meeting of East and West, and whose cabinet is a coalition of 4 parties, President Edward Beneš was able to say,
"You can see in the streets of Prague, everybody is working, everybody is is enthusiastic. There is a very great elan, a very great enthusiasm, spirit for the work, and all they knew that they are working for a new liberty and for a new independence.
In New Zealand, there were only two major parties in the government, but here again, there was a blend of the better features of two economic philosophies, both of which were living side by side very comfortably. Hence, it occurred to me that if a united country can base its future on a combination of the most workable features of opposing systems, we have no right to rule out the possibility that the same can be done by a united world. Indeed, I came back from this trip with the belief that the very basis of a democratically united world is the establishment, first of the will, then of the means, by which differing social and economic systems can live amicably together. And the most important contribution to be made toward this goal is to convince the peoples of the world that a third war is not necessary or inevitable. This task of debunking the cry that war must come was considered by most of the informed people we met to be the first and most urgent responsibility of the great powers. And it struck me that perhaps the worst possible approach from any side is to attempt, by propaganda, polemics, intimidation, or by force, to persuade either one of the two systems to abandon what it considers its righteous course for the other, especially since, down through history, such attempts have only widened, not narrowed, basic differences. That the people of the world are more interested in agreements than in differences was hardly an original thought. The British Minister of State, Philip Noel Baker, now Minister of Air, voiced this very sentiment in one of the first interviews of the trip.
Nobody denies that after a war you're going to have a lot of trouble and a lot of quarrels before you can settle down to ordered peace. For my part, I think things are going much better than I expected. I lived through the period after the last World War, and I knew how much worse the destruction was this time and how much more widespread the fighting had been. And I expected things to be a good deal worse than in fact they are. But what I am quite certain of is that the people want agreements.
Well, there are only a few minutes left to this one-world flight, and I come now to a final accounting. In the 17 countries of this journey, we found things which both disheartened and encouraged, elated and dismayed us. Perhaps the single most hopeful sign was that most people no longer considered it sentimental and idealistic, visionary, to talk in terms of a unified world in which security and peace are sensations greater than tension, hostility, crisis, and war. They listened soberly to such talk, and though many of them had doubts as to the way of achieving one world, or were cynical about their chances of living to see it, they all wanted it, they yearned for it, they were willing to work for it. There were the ugly aspects, too, the smoldering political dumbfires which, unheeded or deliberately fanned, could spread and envelop the earth again. Hunger and poverty, ignorance and disease lay like a smoke haze across the Middle East, India, China. The homeless slept on the sidewalks of Cairo and Nanking. The stench of decomposing corpses rose out of the sewers of Calcutta. There were pogroms in Poland, riots in Italy, bombings in Palestine, massacres in India, civil war in China and the Philippines. Against such troubles, involving hundreds of millions of human beings, the hopeful things of the world may seem few and scattered, lonely and shivering and lost, but they're actually far from lost, far from hopeless. The majority of people we talked to felt that to despair of the world today is to resign from it. To assume that human nature is committed to another war is to assume that suicide is a natural remedy for our ills. If I learned anything out of the many miles and hours, the many meetings and events, the many people and the leaders of people, it was that each one of us can help the world to its feet. We can first of all stop thinking in terms of war and start thinking in terms of peace. We can stop taking the view that every difference between nations is necessarily a crisis.
we can realize and accept the fact that the problems and maladjustments of this particular era are a direct consequence of the fiercest war in all history. A housewife in Wellington named Mrs. Jeffries, living 18,000 miles from the office of Mr. Noel Baker in London, had a formula for the relationship of the individual to peace and one world.
Work hard for the goodwill and the happiness of all the people nearest to you, and then increase your efforts as you get further and further out to the circumference of the circle, that circumference to be the circle of the globe. And I think that if each individual every day and in every way works sincerely and hard and unflinchingly towards that end, and then prays hard for that ideal, I think it might come.
The informed and articulate people of the earth, of whom Mrs. Jeffries is representative, have a conscience and a will. The will is to be free and peaceful in a single world, to resist corruption and to make none of the old mistakes anew. Nobody wants ever to awake in the night again and hear the sound of careless politics raining down on them. These sounds of indiscriminate warfare are obsolete today, not because man has pledged himself to be less inhuman to man, but only because there are far deadlier weapons. Yet, perhaps all such sounds can be banished forever if each of us is willing to assist in the mammoth task of preserving the peace, if each of us is willing to accept his share in what is far and away the greatest challenge of our lives and the greatest opportunity of our time, the making of one world. Ladies and gentlemen, in behalf of the One World Award Committee, I have the honor to announce in a moment the winner of the One World Flight Award for 1947. Formal presentation of the award will be made at a public function in New York City on May 11th, and on a date later in the year, the recipient will take off on the second annual One World Flight. The citation of the committee reads as follows. In appreciation of his outstanding public service, both nationally and internationally, and particularly in recognition of his fearless expression through the radio and press of the highest ideals of one world, the One World Award Committee has named as 1947 winner Fiorello H. LaGuardia, former mayor of New York City and Director General of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. Mr. LaGuardia is listening to this program tonight at his home, and I know that the rest of our audience will join us when we wish him the best of luck and happy landings.
You have been listening to Norman Corwin, CBS playwright, producer, and first winner of the One World Flight Award, in the last of a series of 13 broadcasts based upon his recent global trip. Guy Della Chapa was associate director of the series, assisted by Richard Tila. Lee Bland, who accompanied Mr. Corwin about the world, supervised the transcription process. Special engineers were Harold Warner, Carl Harris, and Armand Gagnon. Alexander Semler composed and conducted the musical scores for the series. This is Lee Vines, and this is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. The Columbia Broadcasting System presents One World Flight.
The Americans
don't know quite exactly what is going here, and we don't know here what is going in America, what is going on in America, what are the conditions, and so on, especially social conditions, and so on.
You are listening to Edward Beneš, President of Czechoslovakia, speaking at his desk in the presidential office of the Rachani Palace in Prague, Czechoslovakia, during an interview with the CBS playwright-producer, Norman Corwin. The voice of Mr. Beneš is one among several authentic sounds and voices recorded inside Czechoslovakia, to be heard on this sixth of a series of 13 broadcasts based on Mr. Corwin's recent 37,000-mile global trip as first winner of the One World Flight Award.
This is Norman Corwin. From Moscow to Prague is a distance of about 1,200 miles as a plane flies, and on a day in late July, an unsettled day in which the weather changed from country to country, we flew that leg of the One World flight. The land beneath us, with its frequent streams and rivers, looked as green and innocent as though it had never heard the names of old wars, nor the rumor of new ones. Yet not long ago, over every inch of the distance we were consuming so quickly and comfortably, armies had fought, blood had mixed in the streams and rivers, villages had been sacked, cities bombed. A dead man for every foot of the way. We flew over White Russia, Poland, a thin slice of Germany, crossed the Czech border, and soon sighted the Vltava, better known through music as the River Moldau, coiling around the terraced hills of Bohemia. And then, in a matter of minutes, the towers, bridges, rooftops, chimney pots of Prague. Prague is a graceful city, Baroque and Gothic, with a skyline of radio transmitters and cathedral spires. Its ancient history is obscure, but Czechoslovakia's modern history the whole world knows only too well. This country, slightly smaller than Wisconsin, was the republic handed over to Hitler at Munich by agreement of two sister democracies. It was the vortex down which all of Europe was to be drawn. I was naturally anxious to see what betrayal and occupation and the trials of Reconstruction had done to Czechoslovakia, whether its people were happy and confident, whether they were still friendly to the United States, the country which had done so much to create their republic, how they felt about Russia, whether they were, as we'd been told along the way, a bridge between East and West, whether they were in a mood to embrace the concept of one world. I had no trouble getting answers to these questions. In no other country did I find people more articulate about themselves and the world. Nowhere a deeper sense of anti-fascism. For as President Beneš said in an interview of which you'll hear more later,
every Czech must be anti-fascist. And every Czech must be against any whatever revival of fascism everywhere. Because with the fascism is connected intimately the greatest injustice which has given mate against us.
This attitude seemed consistent all the way from the presidential office down to the coal mines. One afternoon, we drove out to Kladno, the mining city northwest of Prague, and went down into the Beneš pits, named after the president. In no time, we were surrounded by miners, each eager to speak into the microphone to be heard above the din of mine machinery. Mrs. Slavka Gregorova of the Czech radio acted as interpreter, and in the following exchange, I have eliminated for the sake of time all translations going into Czech and the Czech replies. My first question was whether they were worried about another war.
Yes, we are afraid of war, mainly because there is still Germany with so many Nazis and fascists who are allowed to carry on as before. And also another reason is that there is still the Franco Spain, which is always a new incentive for another war.
Most of the men were internationally minded, but I found at least one isolationist. This fellow told our interpreter,
well, I'm only a simple worker, he says. And I look at the things in this way. Europe belongs to the Europeans, America to the Americans, and whatever we do at home is our own affair.
I asked the miners whether they were inclined more to the east or to the west, and I got an answer indicating how deeply Munich had affected their attitudes and how well they remember it.
He says that with 99% we incline towards the east, and only with 1% we incline towards the west. We are Slavs, and we belong to the large Slavonic group of nations. And whenever we look at the past, we know what has happened to us from the west.
I asked another miner what, if he could make a wish tonight that might come true tomorrow, he would wish for.
Well, I'd wish this, that all the gentlemen from the west and from the east would realize that we are men, that we are human beings, and that they would adjust their politics according to that they would adjust their politics to serve humanity, to serve mankind. And as long as they don't do this, we won't have any peace.
Back in Prague, I talked to some students who were planning a World Student Congress for the following month. They, too, were insistent on the anti-fascist character of their movement. One of them, Miss Masalkova, said,
Yes, we feel that there is a great danger. There's a great danger for fascism still now in Europe, for instance, in Germany.
And I found that in Czechoslovakia, as in most of the Europe conquered and occupied by Hitler, the terms fascist and fascism took on different meanings from what was generally given to them back home. In America, to a great many, fascist is often merely a bad name you call a person whose politics you don't like. It's a term thrown about loosely when a group breaks into heated argument. Some of us are prone to call each other fascists or communists over issues ranging from labor unions through rent control to atomic energy. But in a country like Czechoslovakia, a fascist means something quite real, not theoretical. The people of Prague saw fascism march down their main street. They saw their friends taken out of their homes and shot. They were tortured. It seemed that almost everybody we met had either personally suffered or was related to somebody who had been tortured or killed by the Nazis. Young Jan Silvera, for example, who assisted us in these recordings. He was the only one of a family of 18, including parents, brothers, sisters, uncles, who was not executed by the Nazis. Yet none of these people seemed bitter or cynical. They were resolved to do everything they could not to let it happen again. But their resolution was never vindictive. It was calm, reasoning, and vigilant. I asked Dr. Seeby of the Czech underground, who had been tortured and sentenced to death by the Nazis. I asked him what he, as a man to whom fascism and war held a very deep personal meaning, what he would most urgently recommend to the United Nations. He replied,
This is what would be my message, my humble message to the United Nations. Not to breed the idea that there is a necessity of a war between the West and the East, between the Western and Eastern conception of life. I know that this is the last hope of fascism. They do everything, especially in Germany and in any part of the world, to breed this conception.
One day, Bill Kugelman of the American Embassy drove us out to the town of Dobrich to visit a palace occupied by an association of Czech writers. The drive began in the heart of Prague, which city is as noisy as it is beautiful, and that's getting into a lot of noise. This recording of normal morning traffic will give you some idea. Prague, after Warsaw and Moscow, had an air of prosperity. It was second only to Stockholm among European capitals we visited in its appearance of well-being. Stocks seemed to be high in the stores. Produce was plentiful. You could even buy canned tomato juice, a luxury unheard of in most of the world outside of the United States, for the equivalent of 6 cents without any ration ticket. We drove through busy, narrow streets, past a monument enshrining the first Russian tank to enter the city in the battle for liberation, then into the outskirts, and followed a bank of the Vltava to the countryside, to the romantic, non-political bohemia of song and legend. We went through magnificent pine groves and wound among wooded hills. My colleague, Lee Bland, reminded us, looking out at this first-class scenery, of how much first-class culture, how much good literature and music had come out of this little country. Tunes long familiar to Americans, tunes like Humoresque. And the Dances of the Bartered Bride by the Czech Smetana. And the familiar polka by the Czech Weinberger. Czechoslovakia is understandably proud of its artists, and it seems generally to take loving care of its culture, at least if its treatment of writers is any indication. When we reached the palace at Dobrich, we found it to be pretty much the kind you've built for yourself at some time or other in an architectural daydream. Big, sprawling, opulent, with formal gardens and a swimming pool, library, ballroom, marble bathtubs and all that. The new coalition government decided writers were a national asset, and so it bought and turned over to a writers' syndicate this expensive palace. To join the syndicate, a writer must have 3 published books to his credit or 3 plays produced. Then the writer may, if he chooses, live at this palace for a stated period of the year, meals included, with or without family, for $2 a day. When we arrived, children were running around the palace chasing puppies. I asked their parents whether they had come there to work or to rest.
When they came here, they called it a house of recreation, but they hope it'll develop into a house of creation. And now it seems that really people are beginning to work here, and when you awake in the morning, you can hear about 10 typewriters rattling away, so it looks as though something was going to be created here.
For a whole afternoon, we talked with a score of poets, novelists, essayists, playwrights, and it was pretty clear that they had a highly socialized sense of art. A young woman novelist, Miss Stenglova, had a personal formula for the relationship of the individual to the state.
I am a Czech, and whatever happens to my nation happens in the first place to me. So that all I can do with my work is to say I am a good Czech.
These writers, like most people we met all the way around the world, were very curious about America, and their curiosity took the form of direct questions. I thought you might like to hear what people ask about us in a country like Czechoslovakia, and so I recorded, one after another, a series of such questions.
Dr. Yurka would like to know if America has the right information about this country. Mr. Dada, the novelist, asked whether America, with the Lincoln and Washington tradition, and America, which has in its hands today the fate of the world with the atomic bomb, whether America would be capable of using this dreadful weapon against progressive democratic regimes.
What are the American people really like? And what is America?
Dr. Naumann would like to know if from the American economic system there's not going to develop a new economic imperialism in the world. Dr. Tunam would like to know how the young American people have reacted to the war and the problems subsequent to the war. Mr. Shafranek would like to know what truth there is in the rumor that the Americans in the American zone of Germany prefer the Germans to other people.
You will have noticed that some of these questions implied criticism of American policy, but it would be a mistake to assume that this meant unfriendliness. The Czechs, from all I gathered, have never forgotten America's role in helping them to establish their republic 29 years ago, and it was a pleasant surprise for me, on July 26, 1946, to find an American flag made of flowers blooming handsomely at a monument to Woodrow Wilson on one of the main streets in Prague. I mentioned this in the course of an interview with Jan Papanek, Czech minister plenipotentiary, and he remarked,
Yes, and they are rather proud of it. They did not change. They continue to have the same feelings toward the United States. They appreciate, are thankful for all the help they have received during the war from them, and this flag is only a small sign of what they feel, what they express, and will be expressing in the future.
Mr. Papanek described the changes in Czechoslovak's economy brought about by the coalition government, a government consisting of 4 parties: Social Democrat, National Socialist, not in the Hitler meaning of National Socialist, by the way, People's Catholic, and Communist, with the latter holding a plurality in the number of seats. Mr. Papanek said that these changes, such as nationalization of heavy industries while retaining free enterprise in most of the lesser categories, were for the good of the country, and though they were at variance with American practice, need not alienate the friendship of Americans.
We hope that America will understand us. We are trying to reshape our national, our economic life. We are trying to do it for the best of our people, of all of them, and we are set to succeed.
As an American interested in prospects for one world, I shared with other Americans in that country a sense of pride in the example of a scientific body working there at the time. This was the medical mission of the Unitarian Service Committee, a group of outstanding American doctors who had volunteered to bring to the Czech people some of the techniques and drugs from which they had been cut off during the long Nazi occupation. These doctors, working without compensation and taking time away from their practices at home, lectured to medical faculties of universities, performed operations, and conducted clinics. It was a gesture of goodwill which had the full cooperation of our State Department, and it was not lost on the Czechs. One of several appreciative articles to appear in the Czech press was entitled, "This is what international relations ought to be." Mixed in with the warm sentiment toward America of the Czechs we met was a genuine love of Franklin Roosevelt. And typical of its expression was a statement by Bretislav Prokoska, president of the Czech Society for International Relations. We met in his office, and the noise is that of traffic in the street below.
As the people of United States of America concerns, I would only have this wish. They should be all in their feelings to our country in this manner as the late President Roosevelt was. We know very well that Roosevelt was one of the best friends of our country. And if there hasn't been the personality of Roosevelt, I don't know how this last war had finished.
This reverence for the memory of Roosevelt was shared by most of the Czechs we met, including the first citizen of the country, President Edvard Beneš. We went to see him one day in the presidential palace. The appointment was made informally through our friend Kugelman at the American embassy. No pass was required. Nobody challenged us at the gate. If there were guards about, I didn't see any. Somebody had forgotten to tell the president that I was bringing along a wire recorder. Moreover, he had never been recorded in this manner, not even for the Czech radio, and so a matter of precedence was involved. But he brushed all this aside. After a few pleasantries, we plunged right into the interview. I asked Mr. Beneš point blank whether he thought there were irreconcilable differences between East and West.
I don't think so. On the contrary, I was always the man who tried to persuade that there is no fundamental difference, and especially that they are not the reasons for any conflict between the East and the West.
I then asked Mr. Beneš whether he looked upon his country as a bridge between the U.S. and the USSR.
Well, my formula is a little different. I don't say we are a bridge. I say we are not between the East and the West, although it is sometimes said so. Yes. I say that we are between the Russians and the Germans. Yes. On the West, we are surrounded by the Germans. In the East, we are the neighbors of Russia, Soviet Russia. Yes. And I say, if any possibility of a reconstruction of Germany will arise again, yes, until Germany will come again to the power, or if somebody, either from the East or from the West, would use Germany again to reconstruct them and use their power against somebody, we would be the first always to be attacked by the Germans.
I was anxious to find out what the president thought of Czechoslovakia's progress in recovering from the war, so I asked him...
Mr. President, before my arrival in Prague, I was told by a number of people that Czechoslovakia was making the most rapid recovery and the best adjustment to international conditions of any country in Europe. Is this true? And if so, to what do you attribute it?
According to my view, it is true. The reasons are rather complicated and numerous. First of all, we have not been devastated by the war in such a degree as many of the European countries were.
Yes, I see.
Second, the German occupation has strengthened the moral of Czechoslovakia. The third reason was that we have felt that in Norway we have contributed to the general disaster of the world and of Czechoslovakia. As you know, according to my view, the war began with Munich.
The president then emphasized the importance of remembering what Munich had meant to his country.
I must emphasize that if America, and if the public opinion in America, this once more imagine what meant Munich for a small nation.
Again and again, this plea was made by Czechs of all walks of life. In effect, they all said, please tell Americans not to forget what happened at Munich and the circumstances under which it could happen again. Tell them to try to understand that our attitude toward foreign policy and home economy is different from theirs because our experience was different. The last interview we had in Czechoslovakia was with Professor J.B. Kozak, lecturer in political philosophy at Charles University in Prague. He criticized both the American and Russian definitions of democracy and went on to state the Czech position.
In the United States, too much of equality has been sacrificed to liberties. In the Soviet Union, maybe too many liberties have been sacrificed to the ideal of equality. For the time being, we must place the emphasis on the freedom from want and the freedom from fear. You will understand us. But we are determined to implement all the four freedoms. And we shall do so in this country. Take my word for that.
The professor said he knew America well, having spent some years in this country, including a period on the faculty at Oberlin College. Out of what he had observed of world affairs since he had last been in the United States, he posed 3 questions to Americans at large. They were these.
President Roosevelt, whom I loved very much, once said that the only thing we must fear is fear. How many of you Americans have fear? My second question. I would start from a similar statement. The only persons we should distrust are those who sow distrust. How many of you trust those who are sowing this international distrust? My third question. Do you still believe that free enterprise, I mean without any governmental interference, can prevent or solve economic depressions? Are you sure that you are going to have no more economic depression?
Of economics in Czechoslovakia, Professor Kozak explained that in carrying out the nationalization of heavy industries, the coalition government had performed a practically painless operation because it meant cutting these industries loose from the tentacles of German financial control and did not, therefore, dislocate Czech interests. He credited the new government with having brought the Czechs very far, very quickly.
And, of course, things are improving by leaps and bounds in this country. It is one of the happy islands in Europe, as you have probably found out yourself.
The professor was not alone in agreeing with foreign observers that Czechoslovakia had made rapid recovery. Amid the general austerity, confusion, and devastation abounding in Europe, these people seemed confident of where they were going and had a definite sense of progress. I recalled what Minister Papanek had said.
We are moving. We are set to succeed.
And of what a coal miner named Spadnik had said in Kladno, Spadnik, who had worked in the same mines for 33 years. I asked him,
how do you feel about the recent nationalization of the mines? Teď je práce mnohem nadšenější u všech dělníků, jelikož si považujeme doly, jako by byly naše, že?
He says, the work of all our miners is much more enthusiastic because we all feel we are working on our own.
And what the president himself had said of the condition of his country 1 short year after the liberation.
You can see in the streets of Prague, everybody is working, everybody is enthusiastic, there is a very great elan, a very great enthusiasm, spirit for the work, and all they knew that they are working for a new liberty and for a new independence.
This from the country which, such a short time ago, was dismembered at Munich and later invaded by the invincible Wehrmacht. This from little Czechoslovakia, which was to have been an obedient province of the Greater Germany for the next 1,000 years, the 1,000 years of the fascist millennium. 9 years ago, Czechoslovakia stood at the crossroads of war. Today, perhaps, it stands in the position of a bridge at the crossroads of peace. To many of her people, the way to the future is the middle way, the way they are traveling, a way which reconciles socialism and private enterprise by running them side by side. From where they're standing, looking toward horizons ringed by Russians, Germans, Poles, Romanians, and Hungarians, with a monument to the Red Army on one street and an American flag in flowers on another, they believe this way of theirs is a shortcut to the grand concourse called One World.
You have been listening to Norman Corwin, first winner of the Wendell Willkie One World Flight Award, in the 6th of a series of broadcasts based on his recent 37,000-mile global tour. All recorded voices heard on this broadcast were transcribed in Czechoslovakia. Next week at this time, One World Flight visits Italy. Tonight's musical score was composed and directed by Alexander Semler. Guy Della Chappo was associate director. This is Lee Vines, and this is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. The Columbia Broadcasting System presents One World Flight. are listening to Muslim prayers coming from the loudspeaker system of the Muhammad Ali Mosque in Cairo, as heard above the cheering of thousands of Egyptians on the day last summer that Britain returned the famous citadel to Egypt. This historic recording is among several authentic sounds and voices transcribed inside Egypt and India, to be heard tonight on this 8th of a series of 13 broadcasts based on Norman Corwin's 37,000-mile global tour as first winner of the Wendell Willkie One World Flight Award.
Norman Corwin. On the 9th of last August, in the holy Muslim month of Ramadan, the Union Jack that had flown over Cairo's ancient citadel for 65 years came down, and the green flag of Egypt was raised by its King Farouk. The act was a symbol of Egypt's independence from the British, and it was cheered by a throng gathered in a square below the citadel. That night, both the citadel and the Muhammad Ali Mosque behind it were floodlit. A great searchlight, the kind used during the war to spot aircraft, was trained on the flag. The evening was clear and warm, with exhalations from the African desert stretching away on all sides. The celebrants seemed to cheer every stirring of the flag in the breeze that came off the swollen Nile. And as though to contribute to the vivid mixture of ancient and modern, which is Cairo, an airplane came up from nowhere and flew low over the scene. For a moment, its motors obliterated the voice of the muezzin chanting praises for Allah on the public address system. On a rooftop in the neighborhood of the Citadel, where we had set up our CBS recording microphone, a group of Arab women sang with an abandon that seemed to go along naturally with a bizarre setting of minarets, airplanes, floodlights, domes, cupolas, cheering, and amplified prayer. It was all colorful and wonderful under the amber moon of Ramadan. Everybody seemed gay and animated. Certainly the celebration of independence is a joyous occasion to any nation. But in the hot, bright light of the next morning, it was perhaps reasonable to ask what this independence represented. Independence of whom? For whom? Whether the people who had cheered it last night would profit by it tomorrow. Exactly what these people were, how they lived, what they thought, whether they had fears, hopes, ambitions. We set out, a few of us, to look for answers. Our party consisted of Lee Bland, who handled the recorder, George Polk, CBS Cairo correspondent, Marcel Hitchman, a writer who served as our interpreter, and myself. Our first stop was in Abdeen Square in the vicinity of the King's Palace, and I intercepted the first person to come along. He was a boy, better dressed than most to be seen on Cairo's streets. I asked how many were in his family. What sounds at first like godfather is the boy saying, "I godfather," and so forth.
A good father and a good mother and a good sister and good father and good everything.
All living in the same place?
Yeah.
How many rooms?
2 rooms.
He said he was a mechanic, that he earned 15 piastres a day, which is the equivalent of about 60 cents. In the following recording, you will hear questions by Polk and myself, the interruption of a small child standing nearby, and toward the end, the striking of bells in a tower of the Abdeen Palace.
What sort of food do you eat?
Me? I eat in the morning food and eat afternoon meat and something like that.
Do you buy all this at 15 piastres a day?
I take 15 piastres every day, yeah.
How much?
I take 15 piastres every day. I smoke the cigarette by 5 piastres and keep 10 in my home to get some uniform for myself.
You have to pay food and rent and everything for 15 piastres a day. That's 60 cents a day that you make, and you pay for all your family. How many children do you have?
I have 3 children.
You have 3 children. How old are you?
Me, I'm got 16 years old.
You're 16 years old. You have 3 children.
Yes, sir.
He said he wasn't worried about anything. Said he had heard a rumor that the war was over, but he wasn't sure. He was somewhat better informed about American jargon, for he suddenly used the phrase hubba hubba.
You've seen some American movies, huh?
Yeah.
Is that where you got hubba hubba?
Hubba hubba and take it easy.
What else? Who said hubba hubba?
Okay.
Who did you hear say hubba hubba?
American people, they say hubba hubba.
Well, I'm an American. I don't say hubba hubba.
No, some soldiers, they walk in the street to make hubba hubba, take it easy.
Through Mrs. Hitchman, we next questioned a man named Abdu, who said he was a servant earning 7 Egyptian pounds a month, or about $21.
I said, are you happy now of your life? He says, well, who is happy?
Why are you not happy?
Because everything is expensive.
I asked what he thought of Egypt's independence, of the situation in Palestine, whether he knew the war was over.
He said, I don't care about politics and about war. Who cares about these things?
I asked whether he was at all interested in the world outside of Egypt, whether he would perhaps like to visit some other country.
Where should I go? If there is work somewhere else, all right. But I mean, to go just like that, where?
Let's see. Does he ever get to see a movie?
بتروح في السينما ساعات؟
ما رحتش والله تبارك.
ما تروحش. He never went to a cinema in his life.
Would he like to go to one?
راح السينما. هروح عشان
Why should I go?
He said he had never read a book, that he never read newspapers, that he was not interested in these things at all. While this was going on, a crowd had gathered, and there were rumbles of suspicion and hostility. I started to ask questions of an Arab in a long blue galabia, and he told Polk,
he doesn't like this idea. He thinks it's an insult to his dignity.
Other people in the crowd said they were afraid of being recorded. I asked what accounted for this attitude.
Well, it's quite difficult to explain. First of all, it never happened to them before. And then their technical knowledge is very small. And they don't know what is this, and they think it's mixed up with some movie business. And they just now, especially, they're not very friendly towards foreigners. And they are afraid of stating things definitely. They don't like people who ask them questions. They are always like that. You see, when people ask them questions, it generally brings trouble. It means there is a policeman who comes to ask them questions or things like that. Nobody ever asks them what they think.
Egypt was the 11th country visited in our one-world flight, and though we'd seen bad conditions in other countries, this, for a traveler heading east, was the beginning of really morbid ignorance, squalor, disease. To the eye, Cairo is attractive, both in its medieval and modern aspects. It's checkered with mosques and palaces, ancient walls, towers, domes. The old city has bazaars and narrow, winding streets. The newer quarters along the river achieve a certain European colonial dignity. To the east, behind the citadel, stand barren hills, and beyond that, sandy desert. Just out of town, at the edge of the western desert, are the great pyramids, and in between, the Nile, tree-shaded, romantic, polluted, supporting life and agriculture along its banks, just as it has done since earliest history. In this austere land, where so much of civilization was cradled, there is small tradition for one world, or for anything resembling democracy as we know it. The world of Egypt has been, by turns, Memphite, Theban, Syrian, Persian, Macedonian, Roman, Arabian, Turkish, French, British. Dozens of wars have swept up and down the Nile and have zigzagged across the deserts, and the only constant factor since the days of the pharaohs has been the depression of millions, the poverty, the relentless ignorance. There are schools in Egypt, yes, for the better off. There are also health services of a sort. We were told about them. But as we went around the city, stopping ordinary Cairenes on the street, there was little to show the effect of either education or sanitation. In a big square known as Meydan Ismailia, one of the newer and better sections of the city, we interviewed people at random one night. I asked a cook named Ahmed what he thought of conditions in the country.
Too many people no work, too many people no eat, too many people no money.
Too many people no work, too many people no eat, too many people no money. When I asked him what he thought should be done about it, he answered that the government should open shops and factories in order to create more work. He said he was a monarchist because he read in the papers that the king wanted to improve Egypt. I then asked about his knowledge of politics.
Have you ever heard the word fascism?
أنت عارف اللغة فاشيست؟
No. You have not. Have you ever heard the word Nazi?
No.
He has not. Have you ever heard of the word communist?
أنت سمعت الكلمة كومونيستي؟
No.
No.
Have you ever heard of the word democracy or democrat?
أنت عارف يعني الكلمة ديمقراطية يعني؟
Yes. What do you know about democracy?
يعني إيه ديمقراطية؟
ديمقراطية يعني كل الناس زي بعض.
Says democracy means everybody is the same.
Among those we interviewed on Cairo's streets, Ahmed was exceptionally well informed. More typical of the attitude we met with everywhere was that of Mohammed, a waiter. The regime of Ismail Sidki Pasha, since succeeded as prime minister by Fahmi al-Nakrachi, was under considerable attack and criticism at the time, and I asked Mohammed what he thought about it.
How do you feel about the government in Egypt today? The government of Sidki Pasha?
إيه رأيك في الحكومة بتاع سيدكي باشا هنا دلوقتي؟ مبسوط منها ولا لا؟
احنا ما لناش في الدوشه دي كله. اساسا ما لناش دعوه بدي. احنا ولا سياسيين ولا حاجه زي كده. ما نعرفوش حاجه.
Says we don't care at all in all these troubles. We don't participate in these troubles, and we don't hear anything about it, and we don't want to hear anything about it.
I asked Mrs. Hitchman, long an observer of Egyptian affairs, why so many of the people shied away from any kind of political thought or expression.
They are afraid. They are afraid of every kind of authority. They know that every time they come in contact with authority, they are unhappy. So they are afraid of doctors, they are afraid of policemen, they are afraid of the government, they are afraid of everything.
The ignorance which lay like a pall over the people was not confined to any particular district. It should be borne in mind that these recordings were made not in a backwoods area in Tobacco Road country, but on the streets of the biggest city in Africa, a modernized, busy city which for centuries has had access to the best of Eastern and Western culture. In the hope that samplings made thus far were not entirely representative of the Egyptian man on the street, I tried again in still another district. The first man here was a worker, father of 2 children, sole support of his mother and father. He earned $1 a day. In the following recording, you will hear the man say in answer to a question, throughout the Middle East, this means no.
Has this man ever been outside of Cairo?
أنت رحت برا من مدينة مصر أبدا؟ Never.
Does he read?
بتقرا وتكتب؟ He doesn't read, he doesn't write.
Has he ever seen a moving picture?
رحت في السينما أبدا؟ No, he said, never.
Has he ever heard a radio?
He says he listens to music from the Egyptian state broadcasting, but not to the news.
On his own radio? Does he own a radio? You look at me with the expression which means, what a foolish question.
It is, because they hear the radio in that way. They hang a radio very high up the ceiling of the cafe, and it's kept open night and day, so everybody hears the radio.
I see. There are very few home sets here.
They just can't dream of it. They haven't got enough money to buy clothes. How could they buy radios?
We next talked to a man who said his home was 4 miles from the Nile, and I asked when he had last seen the river.
He hasn't seen the Nile for the last 8 years.
That's 4 miles away, and he hasn't seen it in 8 years. Now, fine. I don't want to let this boy go away. I'd like to talk to him. Has he ever gone to school?
رحت في مدرسة أبدا؟ رحت وطلعت. كم يوم قعدت هناك. يجي شهرين. He went only for 2 months to school and then he left.
How long ago was that?
امتى؟ زمان؟ بقالي كتير يعني. بقالي 3 سنين. 3 years ago.
I see. How old is he now?
عمرك كام؟ 16 سنة. He claims he's 16.
He looks about 13, doesn't he?
Yes. But generally they don't know their age.
An airplane passed overhead a moment later, and I asked the boy whether he'd like to fly in one. At first he said no, and then he said, tomorrow, if I work for Hitler, maybe I'll ride a plane.
How did he hear about Hitler?
Well, during the war.
Yeah. Does he know Hitler's dead?
انت عارف اللي هتلر مات؟ ها؟ انت عارف اللي هتلر مات؟ لا. ما حدش قال لك؟ Nobody ever told him that Hitler is dead.
Does he know who won the war?
مين كسب الحرب ده؟ أو ساعات يقولوا الإنجليز، ساعات يقولوا هتلر. Some people say the British, some people say Hitler.
I see. And has he ever thought he would like to find out really who won the war? Is he curious to know?
It took some time to make the boy understand this last question, and in the process, a man of about 35 who was standing nearby, a cemetery caretaker, took part in the discussion. Finally, they both answered it.
The boy says he doesn't care, and the other man, the other caretaker, says, well, in the end, Hitler will win.
In the end, Hitler will win?
Yes.
George Polk noticed that the caretaker had an eye infection, and he informed me that 90% of Egyptians suffer from eye diseases, and that the incidence of blindness is very high. I asked Mrs. Hitchman to ask the Arab what he was doing about his eye.
I said, well, but why don't you go to some clinic or something? He says, I have no money.
Isn't he afraid of going blind? So many persons are blind here. You see them wandering in the streets. So many persons blind.
خايف اللي واحد يوم عينيك هتروح وهتكون أعمى.
كان يعني ربنا موجود.
So what should I do? God is there, and if God wants me to be blind, I'll be blind.
The statement, God is there, was accompanied by a gesture of pointing to heaven. The government of Sidki Pasha last summer had one absorbing internal preoccupation, and it was not that of alleviating the poverty or sickness of its people. It was the hounding of liberals. The editor of the principal newspaper of the Wafda, an opposition but not leftist political party, was arrested. So was the Greek millionaire Zabini, known to be sympathetic to the anti-royalist movement in his home country. 11 cultural, scientific, educational, and labor associations were suspended. Hundreds of people were jailed for weeks without charges. Months later, on November 8th, the New York Times reported from Cairo, and I'm quoting, "The Red Scare in Egypt has passed off without proof of the existence of a communist organization. Nearly all persons arrested have been released. The roundup resulted in the detention of an assorted lot of intellectuals, social reformers, labor leaders, and foreigners. Some would be described outside Egypt as liberals or socialists, but those arrested included some who were plainly capitalists, including millionaires. Others appeared to be simply opponents of the government." End of quote. At the time we were in Egypt, 3 months before that dispatch appeared, the assorted lot of intellectuals was in jail. And it seemed to me that the Egyptian people themselves were behind the bars of their own ignorance. If there was any awareness of the concept of one world in ordinary Egyptian life, it must have been as rare as a well-fed child, as rare as a well-paid worker, as rare as a literate farmer. We left Cairo for India at dawn one morning on a converted York bomber and flew across the glaring deserts of Transjordan, Syria, and Iraq. Geographically, this was the middle of the Middle East. Socially, in point of progress, it was the Middle Ages. The great and terrible bond among these many countries, stretching all the way from the mouth of the Nile to the mouth of the Ganges, is rank poverty, disease, abysmal ignorance. We crossed the vast swamplands lying between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers and landed at the sizzling river port of Basra to refuel. Then we took off again and flew out over the Persian Gulf. The waters of the Gulf were a sickly, bleached-out blue. For nearly 1,000 miles we followed the dry, rugged west coast of Iran, and as night fell, we were droning over the Arabian Sea. In the middle of the evening, we landed at Karachi, India, a port well known to American soldiers who served in the Far East. On the day that we were to take our recorder on the street so that you might hear the voices of Indians, religious rioting broke out between Hindus and Muslims, and our movements were blocked. In Calcutta, we found martial law when we arrived. We had to watch our step to avoid treading literally on the corpses of slain rioters. We could get no transportation to carry our recording equipment, no batteries to run it. And without recordings, whereby you could hear directly from more than a few Indian people, it would be arrogant to comment upon a situation so complex that men who have given years to the study of India's problems shrug their shoulders when you ask them about prospects of unity within any reasonable time. India, as you know, is a land divided by hundreds of languages, religions, castes, and customs. Its political problems at the moment are as difficult as those of almost any troubled spot in the world. Instead of attempting to present any rounded picture of the turbulent Indian scene as it existed last summer, we will limit our report to an interview with the one Indian leader of world renown available to our microphone during the period of our visit. He is Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Minister of External Affairs and Commonwealth Relations. We recorded Mr. Nehru in the modest home of his nephew. He was wearing the round white cap of the Indian National Congress Party. His sensitive face was drawn and sober. For almost an hour, we talked on a wide variety of subjects. First about Wendell Willkie, whose book One World he said he had read in prison while under detention by the British for political reasons in 1942. We then discussed the international situation, which at that time was badly inflamed. I asked what he considered the greatest threat to the peace.
Well, I should say the greatest single threat at the present moment is the growing conflict between America and England on the one side, if you like to put them together, and the Soviet Union on the other. That is the biggest threat. I believe that both parties are to blame for it. Blame in the present, blame in the past, because you can't forget the past, you can't get rid of the past. Obviously, you can't ask others to do what you are not doing yourself. And one finds repeatedly on both sides of this, whether it is Russia on the one hand or other countries, Western countries, that they have done things which were wrong, and they have blamed the other party for doing the same thing, more or less.
Mr. Nehru spoke at length of India's problems, which he said were not formed suddenly, but were the accumulation of more than 100 years. He had bitter words for the treatment of Indians in the Union of South Africa, whose racial policy he called, quote, exactly on a par with Nazi doctrine, unquote. I asked him whether there was goodwill in India for the United States, and he replied,
America is a country which attracts for many reasons. At any rate, it has attracted me, although unfortunately I have never succeeded in reaching there yet. It is a vital country, a growing country, a frank country. And it hasn't got all the legacy of past ages which drags other countries down, complexes created. On the other hand, one has a certain sense, at any rate I have, of a certain roughness and toughness, and a strange mixture of democracy and the highest pretensions to freedom, and the denial of that freedom, say among to the Negroes in America. That question often troubles us because, well, we ourselves in this country have been guilty in the past, in past ages, of denying freedom to large numbers of our own people. And we are suffering for that. And I think one of the causes of our downfall in India has been the fact that we tried to suppress large numbers of our own people in the past, to get rid of that completely. And when we see that happening elsewhere, especially in a very advanced country like America, which attracts us so much, it is a painful thought. And it colors our opinions about those American declarations of freedom. Apparently, freedom is meant for particular groups, not for all. But if we think of freedom for one world, then all this racialism and one race or one nation or one country being fundamentally superior to another, that has to be given up.
From the vantage point of this pleasant home in New Delhi, a city whose appearance suggests an American university campus more than an Asiatic government center, it was hard for me to imagine the vast Indian subcontinent of 700,000 villages stretching away to all compass points, to sense the stupendous poverty and struggle of its nearly 400 million people. These masses, like the relatively small population of Egypt, come within the bleak area of humanity that we call backward. Backward because of no inherent lacks, but because of economic stagnation and total absence of opportunity. I asked Pandit Nehru what recommendations he would make toward achieving the cooperative and united world of which Wendell Willkie spoke, and he replied,
"You cannot cooperate with people who are not free and who are suffering from all manner of complexes, of fear and the rest. Therefore, those countries who have power and influence in the world today should themselves give the lead in this matter and work out as rapidly as possible the ideal of, call it the four freedoms or what you like, that no nation, no people should be subjected to another. No race should be considered an inferior race as a race. And that the only way really for even the most advanced nations to carry on in the future is for backward nations to come up, to remove poverty and to cooperate in the task of raising humanity as a whole and not concentrate so much on a particular area of it. If that viewpoint is adopted and acted up to, perhaps not wholly, but anyway in a large measure, then maybe the whole psychological atmosphere of the world will change. Then probably we'd move much more rapidly to the one world of which Wendell Willkie talked.
Mr. Nehru was looking right at America and our principal allies when he spoke of countries who have power and influence in the world today, taking the lead and working out the four freedoms. Perhaps he had even defined a fifth freedom: freedom from subjugation, prejudice, discrimination.
That no nation, no people should be subjected to another. No race should be considered an inferior race as a race.
A simple formula, that, but one that would make life more livable for 3 out of every 4 people alive on this earth today.
You have been listening to Norman Corwin, first winner of the Wendell Willkie One World Flight Award, in the 8th of a series of broadcasts based on his recent 37,000-mile global tour. All recorded voices heard on this broadcast were transcribed in Egypt and India. Next week at the same time, One World Flight visits China and Japan. Tonight's musical score was composed and directed by Alexander Semler. Guy Della Chapa was associate director. This is Lee Vines, and this is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. The Columbia Broadcasting System presents Norman Corwin's One World Flight.
Corwin. On a sweltering night last August, in the middle of the monsoon season, a group of passengers gathered in the office of the China National Airlines in the center of Calcutta, India. We got there right after dinner, although our plane, bound for Burma and China, was not scheduled to leave from the airdrome 15 miles away until 4 the next morning. The idea was that curfew was on after dark. The only vehicles abroad at night were tanks and armored cars. For a week, Hindus and Muslims had been fighting a religious war within the city, and already more than 3,000 had been killed. At midnight, our convoy left for the Dum-Dum airdrome. We rode slowly through deserted streets, passing an occasional burned-out house with embers still glowing. Every now and then our headlamps picked up a corpse, or a group of them, lying on the highway. They had been there for days, decomposing under the hot sun and the steaming rains. The plane was late starting, and the passengers, Chinese, French, and 2 Americans, Lee Bland and myself, sat around drinking a warm chemical solution named lemon pop. There were no stars, no moon, no breeze, no traffic, no conversation. Far off on the horizon was a red glow which might have been burning houses. I heard a dog bark somewhere, distantly, and I thought about the dead lying on the Dum-Dum road. Whatever it was they started out to prove, it was still unproven. India was asleep. 400 million Indians, in their age-old poverty and misery, were sleeping another night through. Eastward, beyond the Bay of Bengal and the mountains and jungles of Burma which lay across our route, 400 million Chinese were sleeping under the same blanket of darkness and privation. With the coming of the new day, they would resume their huge struggle for existence. They, too, were fighting and killing each other. At 5 that morning, when we boarded the plane, tired and sweaty and hungry, I felt that all of us, the whole shebang, you and me and the hundreds of millions of war-weary Europeans and Africans and Asiatics, must be closer to Mars than we are to one world. After 48 sleepless hours, 18 of them in the air, we landed outside the brawling, overcrowded, and fantastic city that is Shanghai. It was midnight. Nobody asked to see passports. With a dozen fellow passengers, we got on a bus, the only transport available, and rode into town. The driver stopped several times on the way to let people off and, incidentally, to help them find the right street and address, and to chat leisurely with bystanders. Each of these excursions took from 10 minutes to half an hour, while the rest of us waited in the bus. It was now 2 in the morning. Bland and I were miffed, but the Chinese passengers, every bit as tired as we, were uncomplaining. It was a detail, infinitesimally small and unimportant, of the quality of patience in a people who for centuries have endured a great deal from those sitting in the driver's seats of China. A city to be noisier than Shanghai would have to be in a state of constant explosion. Here is a recording made on the Bund, the broad embankment along the Wangpu River near Sucha Road, on a normal morning. One of the sounds you'll hear is from an American cruiser anchored in the Wangpu. The disorder of hundreds of coolies, rickshaw boys, the noise of buses, trucks, and trams, of ships and shipping, was topped at one point by the striking of noon on the famous Customs House clock high above the Bund. In the midst of this hubbub, Bill Costello, CBS Far Eastern correspondent, and I stood trying unsuccessfully to get shy Chinese people to talk. The inflation, which in recent weeks has brought Kuomintang, China, to the verge of economic collapse, was spiraling upward last August, and in the following recording you get a glimpse of it on the surface. I noticed a man carrying a great wad of money in his fist, and I asked Costello who that was.
I see one man here with a fistful of money. What does he suppose that is, Phil? This fellow right behind you.
He's probably a messenger for some commercial house who's been sent out to change money.
Well, he certainly must trust the pedestrian to carry such a boodle of money openly in his midst.
Well, actually, I've seen about 10 times that much. This wad, I would say, was about 3 inches thick. I've seen messengers going down the street with a double handful of Chinese money. It would probably stack up 16 inches high. I'd say that a man could comfortably carry in his two hands about $1,000 US, which would be the equivalent of 3 1/3 million Chinese dollars.
A young boy, about 7 years old, came along carrying tea in a copper kettle. He was selling it per cup at a round figure.
What are you selling? What are you selling, son? What is it?
Tea.
Tea?
Yeah.
How much?
$100.
$100?
Yeah.
Prices were on that scale generally. They're much higher now. You could see a movie for 1,500 Chinese dollars, go to a concert at Chung-Shan Park for $4,000, and buy American shoes for $50,000. Shanghai's inflation was exceeded only by its congestion. To carry our equipment by jeep a distance of 3 short blocks in the center of Shanghai one day took us 1 hour and 10 minutes. We were on our way to see the mayor, K.C. Wu, to ask him about that very subject. We found him in his office in City Hall, a short, young, jovial, round-faced man with horn-rimmed glasses and an American education. The mayor explained the acute housing shortage of the city and incidentally gave an estimate of population which would place Shanghai as the 3rd city of the world.
I estimate the Shanghai population will be just a little bit below 5 million. And then many houses haven't been destroyed during the war. So on the one hand, we get less houses. On the other hand, we get much more population. That's why we have this housing shortage.
We discussed a whole series of problems common to Shanghai and the rest of China. Then I asked Mayor Wu what he thought about the future of peace. His answer made no reference to the fighting between Kuomintang and communist armies a few hundred miles to the north. Mutual distrust, he said, was the root of all evil. I asked what he thought the best remedy for this. His answer was general and, in this respect, also typical of the statements of many leaders whom we were to meet in China.
I believe that everybody should show his cards on the table. Everybody should play fair. That's what I'm trying to do here in Shanghai. Shanghai is a sort of international city. We get all populations. But I think that as a mayor of the city, we should do it this way. We should be fair to everybody. We should lay our cards on the table. We try to give everybody, no matter of whatever nationality, the same kind of protection and the same kind of right.
We left the mayor's office and headed back to the tall apartment hotel where we were staying, a building with the highly un-Chinese name of Broadway Mansions. In a few short blocks was cross-sectioned the cosmopolitan character of the city. Movie houses named Uptown, Rialto, and Paris, a Russian restaurant named Jeep, a sign in French, Fabrication des Caisses en Bois, but none had much of a circulation. The common man doesn't read because he can't read, and he can't read because there are no schools for him. In this country, we take for granted all kinds of things which are beyond the wildest imaginings of hundreds of millions in a country like China. A child here is vaccinated for smallpox, diphtheria, scarlet fever. He goes to a public school. He has a park to play in, and so forth. None of that in China worth mentioning. In American cities, we drink water from a tap. In Shanghai, you'd no more think of doing that than you would of swimming in typhoidal Suchow Creek. If a poor man in Shanghai is seized, let's say, with appendicitis, he either gets over it or he dies. In these respects, Shanghai is China. All of the attributes of medievalism, poverty, disease, ignorance, squalor, are to be found side by side with wealth, education, art, and social refinements, all within small compass. This, at least, we observed in the 3 big cities we visited in Kuomintang, China. That is, Kuomintang as opposed to communist China, for there are 2 Chinas, and we did not get to the second. But within the limits of what we did see, there seemed to us a marked difference between the depressed classes of the Middle East and India and those of China. The Chinese seemed to be relatively cheerful and purposeful, not happy about their lot, but not brooding either, not squatting on their haunches. Unless they are perniciously poor or actually starving, they indicate a sense of humor. They'll smile at you. They like a song. They express the basically sweet nature that comes through such popular folk tunes as this beggar's song, which we heard in Nanking. Among these people, as you'd suppose, there was little awareness of international issues. Unlike the Egyptians, whom some of you heard on this program last week, the city Chinese, at least, knew that the big war was over, but they were too absorbed with day-to-day problems to worry about veto power, Greek elections, or trouble in Palestine. Not even at the cultural level of writers, artists, and actors was there much concern. Mr. Hu Yi-Kwan of the Kuomintang's Central Cultural Commission in Nanking told me,
in these days, the life or the living conditions in China are so difficult that many cultural workers cannot think in anything else but their own living problems. They have very little time to spare to think of international issues, which is not very close to their own lives.
I found as I went about meeting people in the cultural field that I could get no more than general answers to specific questions. At a film studio one day, I talked for hours with actors and directors, and somehow the conversation kept returning, as though by gravitational force, to movies. Miss Ching, a very pretty actress, spoke of her favorite Americans.
我比较喜欢这个 Humphrey Bogart, Charles Boyer, and Gary Cooper.
Humphrey Bogart, Charles Boyer, and Gary Cooper. Shelley Lowe, a director, spoke of the Chinese film industry, which he said was in a bad way.
在资本在这个很严重这个时期里面呢，因为我们中国人有一样很特殊的这个。
Film production in China is difficult because we don't have enough raw materials and equipment, and actors have to work at a salary set by the government. About the boldest statement was that of a young musician whom I asked why so little contemporary music of other countries had been introduced to China.
Well, I think you must put this question to our Minister of Education.
Outspoken comment, either pro or con the Kuomintang government, was difficult to get within the little of China that we saw. It was explained to me that liberals, who were against both communists and Kuomintang, were having a hard time of it. A scandal during the time of our visit was the recent assassination of two leading liberal professors in Kunming. Both were graduates of American universities, non-communists, and outspokenly critical of the regime of Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Kuomintang party. Liberals complained that they were caught in the middle, that without armies to back them up as the communists had, they were at the mercy of Kuomintang extremists. On the other hand, leading communists enjoyed diplomatic immunity. At a reception for us in Nanking, arranged by the Kuomintang Ministry of Information, communist representatives were invited. Yet, within this turbulent situation, there was considerable homage on all sides to the ideal of one world, as set forth by Wendell Willkie 5 years ago in his book. Scores of people to whom he talked had either met Willkie when he visited China or had known about him. I was told at least 50 times by proud Chinese that the idea of one world had ancient beginnings on their soil and had had the services of no less distinguished an exponent than Confucius. At the reception, for example, Dr. Peng Shi-pei, Kuomintang Minister of Information, opened a program of speeches with an allusion to this fact.
Mr. Corwin, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy that you arrived at our capital on the birthday of Confucius, who is the forerunner of the one-world idea.
And Dr. H.H. Kung, himself a descendant of Confucius, explained that the Chinese equivalent of the phrase one world had been in circulation for centuries, that it was a popular motto to be found among the most honored inscriptions on public buildings.
The title One World, the title of the book, One World, has been translated into Chinese and
天下一家 which literally means one family under the heaven.
The Chinese respect the motto, one family under heaven, but unfortunately, as the world well knows, China is itself by no means one family. Of the two Chinas, the bigger, representing roughly two-thirds of the country, is under the regime of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, a regime which his enemies call a tyrannical dictatorship. The other, centering in Shanxi province, is in the hands of Chinese communists, whose regime the Kuomintang calls equally bad names. The two factions have been fighting for years, and until recently the United States, through General Marshall, tried to mediate. That mission failed. General Marshall explained the failure and placed the blame on both sides. Correspondents who had been in China for years and to whom we talked could not agree on who was responsible. I certainly was in no position to make a decent estimate, as I did not get to communist-held territory, and with the exception of 2 interviews with high communist spokesmen, I had little opportunity to meet Chiang's enemies, nor did I meet the Generalissimo himself. At that time, the machinery of mediation was still intact, and the principle of seeking peace was given voice. Dr. Sun Fo, son of China's first president, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and himself president of China's Legislative Yuan, said,
I believe, naturally, that the Chinese government and the Kuomintang are really sincere about peace within China. I also believe that the Chinese Communist Party is also sincere about peace. For there is no man in his senses who would want war and bloodshed.
The chief spokesman for the communists in Nanking was General Zhou Li, a soldier and a statesman famous in Chinese revolutionary history. We interviewed him at his small, crowded house on the edge of Nanking. Through an interpreter, he told us that the Chinese communists had welcomed the coming of General Marshall to China as mediator. He said that the early mediation was successful, but that Chiang Kai-shek had violated agreements and, by doing so, frustrated Marshall's work. He pinned the blame on the Kuomintang and was equally critical of American aid to Chiang Kai-shek.
I feel sure that the American people would never come to understand why, on the one hand, the American government is mediating in the dispute, in the China's internal dispute. On the other hand, it is rendering all kinds of war supplies and materials to aid one of the two opposing parties which are fighting against each other. We are willing to cooperate with the American people, but we have to criticize the erroneous part of the American policy. We welcome any action taken by the United States government that is in the interest of the Chinese people, such as the mediation in the dispute, over the dispute between the two Chinese parties, and to establish peace in China. We merely criticize the wrong part of that policy, that is, to assist only one party, the Kuomintang party, to enlarge the civil war.
Ever since arriving in China, we had heard a great deal about the so-called executive headquarters in Peiping, 500 miles north of Nanking. The organization, set up by General Marshall, was a bold experiment in peacemaking, and we flew up there one day to take a look at it. Little did I think that our visit would cause a minor incident. Executive headquarters consisted of entire staffs in triplicate, Kuomintang, Communist, and American personnel for each post, operating under 3 commissioners. It served as a sort of fire brigade to put out smolderings wherever they occurred on the long incendiary front between Kuomintang and Communist forces. 30 field teams, each consisting of 3 members, again American, Kuomintang, and Communist, were dispersed over a large area. Whenever trouble arose, a field team was sent at once to the area and remained on the spot until the situation was cleared up. Though the work of headquarters was naturally difficult, there was still hope for ultimate success at the time we were there. We recorded the 3 commissioners, Walter Robertson for the United States, General Chiang Kai-ming for the Kuomintang, and General Ye Chen-ying for the Communists. Mr. Robertson, a handsome, graying man who has since returned to his private occupation of bank president in Richmond, Virginia, explained the American participation.
The United States members of Executive Headquarters are participating as a third party in the role of mediator. This unique organization, an unprecedented operation, is being carried out by trial and error and is continuing through the sound judgment and willing cooperation of all the participating members.
The recordings were made in Mr. Robertson's office, and the opposing Kuomintang and Communist commissioners chose not to be present while each other spoke. My questions, by prior agreement, were limited to the scope of positive accomplishments, principally whether the unity achieved at headquarters could be broadened ultimately to take in the whole of China, whether from their experience as commissioners they had any higher hopes for the realization of one world, whether they had a message for Americans. The Kuomintang general, speaking through his own interpreter, said,
"Each time a program is resolved, we establish added precedent, which will one day be the basis for the arbitration of disputes rather than resorting to armed conflict. I do not believe that executive headquarters has yet had the time to be accepted completely as a model, because our principal problems have been primarily a military nature. However, I state plainly and sincerely that both our accomplishments and our mistakes will stand as a model in the world to come."
General Ye, once Chief of Staff of the Chinese Red Army, began by saying that in the first months, headquarters had been comparatively successful. This, he said, was mainly shown by the fact that civil war ceased in a large part of China. But at this point, General Ye, in his message to Americans, departed from the agreed area of discussion with a criticism of American policy. It was this which touched off the incident I spoke of. General Ye told his interpreter,
"The American mediation fails for two reasons. First, there are still few diehards in China who are not willing to see peace and democracy come to this country. Instead, they are always thinking of eliminating Chinese Communist Party and other democratic forces and maintaining Kuomintang one-party dictatorship. Secondly, the American government gave and still gives the Kuomintang lend-lease military supplies to enable Kuomintang to wage civil war, as well as using American Navy and Marines to support aggressing Kuomintang troops in one way or another. Such one-sided help to the Kuomintang caused the failure of General Marshall's mission. We hope that the American government will change its present double-edged policy so that the Chinese people will have a chance to exert their own pressure to bring about peace."
Mr. Robertson shook his head in protest while Ye was speaking, but he made no comment until the general finished. Then, deeply disturbed, he said, "I, for one, am unwilling to sit here in executive headquarters and listen to an attack on my government in its role as mediator." While this was going on, the Kuomintang commissioner had been summoned, and he protested. Both he and Mr. Robertson had the right to do this, since the law of executive headquarters was that any one of the three commissioners could veto anything. The Kuomintang general demanded that the recording of the last part of General Ye's speech, to which you've just listened, be destroyed. Then it was agreed not to destroy it, but to strike it from the record because it might embarrass the work of executive headquarters. Subsequent to this agreement, of course, the spread of the Civil War, the open declaration of similar communist charges, and the abandonment of executive headquarters has placed Beiping's brave experiment in mediation beyond the pale of embarrassment and given to the material you've just heard an ironic place in the history of the single most effective attempt to bring a halt to China's internal conflict. In the meantime, China struggles on, not only in a war involving millions of troops on both sides, but with inflation and famine crushing the people of Kuomintang, China, which is the only part of China that we saw. A friend of mine who was working for UNRWA, Mrs. Mary Munford, wrote me from Changsha in Hunan province, "No one who has not seen a famine can imagine the suffering of mass starvation. Hundreds of people wandering, dazed and lost in the streets, many of them lying in the middle of the street dying of dysentery, hobbling along with the most terrible leg ulcers covered with flies. The children were the most haunting, little animated skeletons looking old as the hills, the skin drawn back from their teeth. The Chinese themselves, not to see them. I suppose they've grown accustomed to the sight of human suffering. 2,500 years ago, China's great sage, Confucius, laid down some principles for one world. Minister Peng in Nanking summarized them for us one day.
The whole world will be managed for the interest of the people. Men of virtue and talent will be chosen to govern. Sincerity will be adhered to, and good neighborhood will be cultivated. Employment for the able-bodied. Everyone will labor with one's strength, but not only with a view to one's own advantage.
From the starving children of Hunan and the tombstones of the professors assassinated in Kunming, from the fresh graves of soldiers killed in this week's fighting, from all this to the bare beginnings of the world envisioned by Confucius 2,500 years ago, is the vast distance China has yet to travel. And with it, of course, the world. For what happens in China, as what happens in any country, happens to all of us.
You have been listening to CBS playwright-producer Norman Corwin, first winner of the Wendell Willkie One World Flight Award, in the 9th of a series of broadcasts based on his recent 37,000-mile global tour. All recorded voices heard on this broadcast were transcribed in China. Next week at the same time, One World Flight visits the Philippine Republic. Tonight's musical score was composed and directed by Alexander Semler. Guy Della Chapa was associate director. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System. The Columbia Broadcasting System presents One World Flight. You are listening to the hour striking in the bell tower of the town hall of Copenhagen, capital of Denmark on the Baltic Sea. It is one of several authentic recorded sounds of foreign places and voices of foreign people to be heard in this third of a series of Columbia broadcasts. A series based upon Norman Corwin's 37,000-mile global tour as first winner of the Wendell Willkie One World Award.
This is Norman Corwin. On a day last June, I flew from London to Paris in a British plane. When we crossed the French coast, I entered a part of the world which was not accessible to the man in whose memory this very flight had been established. For at the time Wendell Willkie circled the globe in 1942, France was occupied by the enemy. And so were the next two countries whose people are represented in the log tonight, Denmark and Norway. My stay in France was only a week, but that was long enough to see a cabinet fall, to meet 100 assorted Frenchmen, and to be reminded of how beautiful a place is Paris. It's one of the few cities in the world which lives up to the best paintings done of it. You have to walk down its avenues and side streets and along the Seine to understand why Paris is not to be compared to any other city. You have to hear the musical speech of Parisian women to believe the accent is real. For example, in the recording which follows, I find myself as much taken by the voice of Madame Perreux as by what she says. Madame Perreux is Secretary General of the European Center of the Carnegie Peace Endowment, and here she is answering a question of mine about culture.
Universal understanding can only be reached through a better knowledge of one another. And to achieve this, we must have international cooperation in all fields of education, science, the arts, and so forth.
You have to visit Paris to understand why writers and artists and peace conferences have always been attracted to it, and why it has inspired so many composers like our own Gershwin. Do you know his American in Paris? How many songs Americans have written about that town. April in Paris, The Last Time I Saw Paris, Paris in the Spring. The one world of music recognizes no boundaries. Italians, Englishmen, Germans, Spaniards, North, Central, and South Americans all have claimed Paris as their own and set it to music. Even Frenchmen have done it. But Paris isn't like this today. It's still beautiful, but it will be a long time before the old gaiety returns. The war, while it left the city fairly intact, did things to its people. Too many Frenchmen died in the torture chambers of the Gestapo. Too many went hungry. Too many had experience with collaborators. Too many shivered in the cold. Paris, when I was there, was turbulent. On the day I arrived, there was a huge demonstration by communists, 200,000 of them, in protest over a recent attack on their headquarters. It was a peaceful demonstration. There was more of a holiday mood than one of tenseness about the city. In fact, one of the most forceful impressions of France today is the taking for granted of communists as fixtures on the political scene. The communists had just made gains in recent elections and were then the second strongest party in France. Coincident with my visit, the coalition cabinet of Georges Bidault was formed, and one of the first men I interviewed was Maurice Schumann, official spokesman for Bidault's party, the Mouvement Républicain Français. Mr. Schumann, who was very close to de Gaulle during the war, was especially sharp on the subject of Germany. He said, "I think it's suicidal for both East and West to build Germany up in their respective spheres, for then Germany will unite, and German union within is the inverse of unity without." I interviewed Mr. Schumann in his modest flat on Avenue Lyoty, and during our conversation, his infant son was crying in the next room. It was my misfortune that the recording machine, which went with us around the world, wasn't working on that day, or you should now be hearing a unique combination of father and son. Lee Bland, my colleague on the trip, took the machine to Frankfurt, Germany for repairs by American Army engineers, and so most of my talks in Paris, including those with spokesmen for the other two major parties, went unrecorded. The socialist Daniel Meyer seemed depressed. His party had just lost ground to both opponents. His outlook on world peace was reserved, but he was less gloomy about this than about French problems. The communist spokesman was the editor Florimond Bont, whom I interviewed in his office in the barn-like newspaper plant of L'Humanité. Mr. Bont said, "The communists have been almost solely responsible for the rapid recovery of coal production in this country. What the French Communist Party can offer France and the world is quick recovery and full production in all industries." From dozens of other interviews, it seemed apparent that France was deeply preoccupied with internal problems of food, currency, and production, and that within only a small area of government and the arts was there much thinking along global lines. Of course, even in introspective France, one could rely on scientists to think internationally. Frederick Joliot-Curie, Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, was no exception to this rule. Monsieur Joliot-Curie said,
"Scientists and technicians do not and cannot belong to a detached elite soaring above practical contingents. As citizens, and members of the great community of creators and workers, they must be concerned with the use society makes of their discoveries and with practical ways of directing this use towards peace and well-being of mankind.
If you had trouble making some of that out, what Monsieur Joliot-Curie said was, essentially, scientists cannot belong to a detached age soaring above practical contingencies. As citizens, they must be concerned with the use society makes of their discoveries. Almost everybody I met in Paris had a story to tell that sounded more like an exciting novel. Michel Duclos, the underground fighter, who admired my pocket camera and said, "Some of my comrades who were caught by the Gestapo taking reconnaissance pictures would be alive today if they had had a camera as small as yours." Marie, the Polish girl who literally escaped from the Germans on her way to a gas chamber. Paul Dermé, who was devoting his life to the internationalization of radio. Robert Carnet, the noted director, who was disturbed because, he said, the French public looks down on films as a poor relative among the arts. André Siegfried of the French Academy, who said, "I am quite set in my belief that art and politics do not mix." Paul Nelson, American architect and special consultant to the French Ministry of Reconstruction, who told me he was worried about fascism and the atom bomb. He said,
"For as long as there remains the vestiges of fascism any place, the people of France and of America and of the world are in danger." I don't think, Norman, that Bikini represented a great day for American influence.
That word was bikini. I asked him what he thought would make a great day for American influence. He replied with emphasis,
"The great day will be when the experiment will be centered on the utilization of atomic energy for the peaceful benefit of mankind. The big stick has no longer the same force as the productive tool."
And then there was Natya, the blonde and beautiful French pianist, whose father had died of malnutrition and cold, whose brother had been killed fighting the Nazis on the day before Paris was liberated, who herself had handled a gun in the same battle. Paris was full of people like that. They all wanted peace, and they were brandishing their fists at nobody. The symbol of war in France, as in other occupied countries, had been the underground. The fighters of the underground were above ground now, sharing the toils of peace and reconstruction. The most eloquent voice of the resistance movement is Louis Aragon, about whom the American Saturday Review of Literature wrote recently, quote, "It seems clear today that Louis Aragon is the greatest poet of the war that has just ended," unquote. This man served with an armored division, was captured by the Nazis, broke out of prison, and fought on with the Marquis. For his exploits, he received the highest French decoration, the Military Medal. Beaming his comment on America, Mr. Aragon asked us not to forget the crimes of fascism.
"I speak for memory. I speak for active memory. Against war, against fascists. For the sake of American boys, we do not want to need every 25 years on French soil. Active memory in France and in America. Conscious memory of inside and outside enemies."
This was a call for something more active in the way of memory than a mere scrapbook of historical events or a sentimental remembrance of a time or a place. Here was the greatest poet of the war, calling for the kind of memory that motivates eternal vigilance, the vigilance which, by an old American definition, is the price of liberty. His point of view, shared by so many of those who fought hardest for France before and after it went down, remains today my most active memory of France. We drove to Le Bourget to take the plane for Copenhagen. It was reasonable to wonder whether this country, which had been invaded by Germany 3 times in 70 years, would have to beat down another such attack in the next 70. Whether the greatest security for France lay in a Maginot Line or in a power block, or maybe in a type of defense which has not yet been given a chance to test itself. One world. We took off. We flew high. Clouds obscured the face of France and the corners of Belgium and Holland over which we passed, and all but the coastal area of Germany. We caught glimpses of the North Sea and of the outlying Danish islands with their rich green fields, their tight, neat, red-roofed farmhouses, their herds scattered at pasture. 4.5 hours from the time we left Paris, having flown over the territory of 5 different countries, we landed on Copenhagen's Kastrup airfield, which the Nazis had seized without warning on that infamous day in May 6 years ago. Copper roofs, magnificent spires and towers, cobbled streets, bicycles, docks, bridges, Gothic dignity, the moderate antiquity of a city that was thriving 300 years before Columbus set out for America. For my part, and on the basis of my brief stay, I would not quarrel with those who, forever busy with comparisons, have called Copenhagen the little Paris of Scandinavia. The little Paris was suffering from an acute housing shortage, just as big Paris, London, New York, and Los Angeles. The city seemed in good shape. There was rationing of certain commodities, but nothing severe. Denmark perhaps suffered least of any of the occupied countries, a fact nobody would begrudge her. But whatever she went through was bad enough. When I asked a 60-year-old guide named Peter Madsen how he felt about things a year after the liberation, he didn't have to be glib to make himself clear. His very groping for expression had an eloquence all its own.
Well, I regard it as a feeling, you see, as a free man again. You feel free again. Yes, like my countrymen and every citizen of this country. We feel, I can't describe it for you, but it's feeling as being a free man again.
The sense of relief at the defeat of the Nazis had not yet worn off. A phenomenon I was to find in other Scandinavian cities and in other forms. I asked Mr. Madsen whether he was fearful of another war, especially since there was considerable war talk at the time. He answered,
Well, if I should tell you the truth, I don't believe there will be a war in the future. I don't believe. Why? Yes, sir, I should say that I mean that the people all over the world want to work for the peace. Everybody wants to work for the peace now.
Mr. Madsen was more optimistic than 2 other Danes in high position. One, the finance minister, Thorkild Christensen, whose answer, coming after an ominous pause, reflected the deepest gloom.
Do you feel that there is going to be another war?
I'm very much afraid of it. In fact,
You are. You think there's a real danger of it?
I think there is.
And what do you think is the best way of avoiding that?
I think it's impossible to make an adequate answer to that in some few minutes.
I asked the same question of Alsing Andersen, a social democrat who was Minister of Defense at the time Denmark was attacked, and who is now on the Foreign Affairs Parliament Committee.
Do you believe, as do certain political observers elsewhere, that another war is inevitable?
Yes, I do.
Although I was not conducting a poll on the question, I had become curious by now to learn whether this attitude went straight through the government. I therefore put the question squarely to the highest Danish authority on the subject, the Foreign Minister, Gustav Rasmussen.
Mr. Rasmussen, do you think that the world is heading toward another war?
No, I don't. I don't see any reason why a new large war should break out in our time, and I don't believe it will.
I asked Mr. Rasmussen whether Denmark, situated as she is in that vaguely defined zone between East and West, would join with any particular power bloc. The question was asked against the background of Winston Churchill's recent speech at Fulton, in which he proposed an Anglo-American bloc. Mr. Rasmussen replied, quote, "Denmark is not prepared to participate in any combination of powers that might be regarded as a potential threat by other nations, unquote. I asked him what he thought might ease the tension and mutual suspicion then high between Russia and the West. He said,
frankness would be a great help. People should, in general, be less afraid of one another and be less afraid of one another's opinions. The more frankness with which they could state their varying opinions and views, the better.
You will by now have noticed that the Danes speak an excellent English. This is typical of all educated Scandinavians. Not once in my travels through the 3 countries of the peninsula was I beyond the sound of English speech. The smaller countries of Europe are far more accomplished linguistically than we of the English-speaking nations. They have to be in order to get along in that polyglot continent. It's not unusual to find a Dane or a Norwegian or a Czech speaking 4 or 5 or 6 languages. They begin early, as you can gather from this recording of a high moment in the reading of an essay in English by 12-year-old Per Alkesik, who is studying in the Efterslikstelskabetsskola, an elementary school in Copenhagen.
Everything in Denmark is much smaller than in America. In Denmark, we only have very small cities. The biggest, Copenhagen, has 1 million inhabitants and is therefore not bigger than your villages. Here in Denmark, we have no gangsters except the German Gestapo, and they were not Danes.
As Per suggests, Denmark is a small country, and unfortunately for me, my stay in it was correspondingly little. Its attractiveness, like those of its neighbors Norway and Sweden, is out of all proportion to its size. So, it seemed, were its burdens. At the time I was there, Denmark was having to support 200,000 unwanted German civilians who had poured into the country when the American and Russian armies trapped Germany in a giant pincers movement. The cost of maintaining these evacuees totaled 50% of the entire normal pre-war budget of Denmark, and to them it was a bore and a burden. But the Danes were taking it well. They had found out that they could take it and that they could give it during the war, when the Nazis learned to their cost that this plucky little democracy could resist with a vengeance. We left Copenhagen one evening around 9 o'clock, and we flew due north along the arms of the North Sea known by the wonderful names of Kattegat and Skagerrak. The northern sun blazed red in the sky, and our Danish DC-3